Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to the seminar and for the warm welcome. They're lovely conversations I've had this morning already, and the plan for the rest of the day. So I thank you for the intro, mostly for kind of maybe making sure everybody was ready for something different. I love talking to broad audiences about my work and about the value of design research and research through design. And so I'm more than happy to answer questions if you're kind of like, what are we talking about? What is going on? I love more of a kind of interactive, ask question as we go type of talk. And so if you're feeling like you don't know what's going on, just let me know. Yeah, so I'll maybe to help you understand why I do what I do and how I got here, I'll give you just a little bit of a trajectory for how I got there. So I was born in Montreal. I'm French Canadian, and so if some of the words are a little funny, that's because of that. And I studied industrial design as my undergraduate degree. So I was thinking about how do we make physical things for people. And then I worked for a little bit as an industrial designer in Montreal, but then I had so many questions about what happens when some of these physical things have computation get in them. You know, like 2008 is when the iPhone came out, and so there was kind of all of a sudden this idea that you could have a computer on you at all time for anything and anything and everything, and it just kind of really opened up my imagination, and I was like, okay, we need to ask questions about what that means for us. So I moved to Vancouver, BC, so from the East Coast over to the West Coast, to start a master's in interaction design. So moving from industrial design, which is very much concerned about the physical, to more questions about the digital side of things. And that's where I learned what design research was, which is basically you can use design to ask questions, which is kind of what I was doing. You know, this is why I got there. And then also learned that you can actually do a PhD in that. And so I decided to stay and do a PhD and graduated at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology. And then really loved the West Coast and didn't quite want to go back home. And so I applied to an assistant professor job at University of Washington in Seattle and moved down there, where the cherry blossoms are not quite there yet this season. This is an old photo. We are very much in the rain right now, and so everybody's been apologizing to me about the rain here, and I'm like, yeah, don't mention it, it's okay. And so there, yeah, I started in the School of Art History and Design, and I do have a courtesy appointment in HCDE, which is Human-Centered Design and Engineering, very much core to the HCI community on campus, as well as in the DX Arts department, which is the Digital and Experimental art and media department. So I really kind of have kind of this position where I can use art and design as a way to interrogate technology. And so a lot of what I'm going to present today is in that space. Okay, who's heard of research through design? Okay, that's good. Research through design is a methodology where basically you use design as a mode of inquiry. This is your main approach. So design, many of you might know, you're trying to understand different needs, different contexts, and then you're making an intervention. You're ideating, you're kind of thinking about what could we make to change the situation, and then through the making, you're discovering things, you're learning. Usually then like that thing goes on and like exists in the world. In design research, we're using that thing to figure out new ideas, new knowledge. So at Studio Tilt, so it's a design research studio. It's hosted at the School of Art History and Design. And as a studio, we question and reimagine familiar encounters between humans and things. It's a pretty broad statement, but this is kind of, like if I'm trying to explain what it is that we do, it's really both the questioning, so it's critical, it's really about kind of wondering why are things the way they are, and then it's also trying to think, well, if we're not satisfied with what they are, what else could they be? Our intention is not to design the next consumer product. So a lot of people are like, okay, so then like that's going to be sold at Best Buy, next year. And I'm like, no. The goal is really to reflect, to critique, and to imagine alternatives. And then in small, sure, eventually our hope is that we are leading to better, more fair, more appropriate, more relevant, better for people, better for the planet products. But our, the step before that is to kind of be in that critical space. Okay, title of the talk today, Data Imaginaries. And so, of course, in the context of Studio Tilt, we're in here trying to reimagine. And so we're not trying to reimagine data, although maybe a little bit. We're really trying to reimagine how is it that we encounter data? Everybody, when's the last time you encountered data that you saw or met or felt or were with data?
Weather app this morning.
Okay, yes. Saw data on an app, looked at it, decided it was going to rain. Right, any other ones? When's the last time you saw data? Yeah.
I used my body scale this morning.
Oh yeah, okay, so dedicated device, looked at the weight, then you were like, yes. Yeah, you should. Okay, so there's different ways we see data in our everyday lives. Still, if I ask you what does data look like, maybe that's what you're thinking of, right? If you look in Google, you type data, Google search image, why is it that we always think data in this kind of similar way? We have all these interactions, and yet the way that movies are showing it to us, anytime there's a news article about data, there's this weird graphic at the top, and that's what we see. And so that frustrates me. As a designer, I'm like, what else could it be? Why does it have to be that? And what are the dangers of just having that? The real danger is that we have a homogeneous view of what data are, and by extension of what they can do. And so if we're able to broaden what data are, what they look like, or what they feel like, maybe we can start to think about other ways of using or being with data that are potentially less connected to some of the things that maybe we don't want so much. Capitalism, perhaps, surveillance, perhaps, privacy questions, questions of agency. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to kind of shake up a little bit with the work that I'm doing. Okay. In the same vein, if I ask you what is data, these are some of the words that you might think are connected to data. It's usually digital. It doesn't have a real material sense. It may feel objective and true. It may seem homogeneous, and it can also feel universal and clean. Okay. You can see that there's a white space next to that. That's because I want to get to this other list, what's the alternative, right? And so before that, I think what's important to remember is that the system in which data are created, so Ignacio and Klein wrote this really beautiful book, Data Feminism. I really do recommend it to all of you, where they say this extractive system which is the system of kind of capturing and collecting and creating data, creates a profound asymmetry, an imbalance between who is collecting, storing, analyzing data, and whose data are actually collected, stored, and analyzed. The power is really, really strong on the one side, the people who are actually able to analyze the data, and yet, or the companies, very often, right? And then the people who actually produce all that data. And so when we're trying to shift that, to bring back power to people who are creating data, well, maybe we can get to another list. What if we considered data as local, as opposed to it's everywhere? What if it's lively? It has its own life? What if it becomes heterogeneous? It has all these different forms. What if, as opposed to being kind of a standalone thing, it really becomes part of an assemblage, right? It becomes part of the people that created it, of the local, the context that created it. What if we look at it from a personal perspective, from an interpretative point of view, as opposed for it to be completely objective? We know that there is human actions throughout the process of gathering data. Well, that's interpretation throughout. So let's actually be honest about it maybe and agree that that's there. And maybe instead of big data, let's think about small data for a minute. Okay, I know these are not one-to-one, and they are not meant to be. I'm just kind of thinking about two lists of kind of adjectives to think about data. Okay, so that's my pitch. By focusing on the more human qualities of data, if we think about small data calls for reducing the gap between those creating the data and how it may be understood, right? Thinking back at that quote from Data Feminism. And so small data, just to be clear, doesn't mean complete opposite of big data. Instead, small data are intricately linked to the large ecosystems of big data, data economy, and surveillance, but where attention is focused on the personal relationship. So by doing that, I'm not saying we're ignoring all the other links that data have. I'm just saying what would happen if we focused on those personal links just for a minute, or maybe for the rest of the hour. Okay. So that's the question I'm asking. How might creative data representation support other engagements with data? We're looking at those alternatives. We're trying to reimagine. Okay, you looked at the data app, you looked at the weight scale. Sometimes it might look like this, a really long spreadsheet of things. Sometimes it's a quick visualization. Sometimes it's a dashboard, another dashboard, another dashboard. I'm looking, these are all from smart home devices. A lot of my work is in the context of home, context of IoT, Internet of Things devices. And so, okay, like you might also even have your fridge that's, this was a really funny thread by Dan Han who said, WTF, our fridge just emailed us to say we opened the door too many times this past month. Like, if this is your engagement with data, granted, this is pretty funny, but it's funny because it's weird. Which, okay, I also like weird. But is this what we want? Is this where we're going? I hope not. Okay. So I have about 4 or 5 projects I want to talk about today that are all trying to cast data in a really different way, really trying to, go against this, basically. Just trying to see, like, what's going to happen if we don't do that? Instead, do something else. So I'll go through them relatively quickly because I want to be able to show you the variety of projects. But I also invite questions kind of along the way. So the first one is the listening cups. I'll pass them around. These are 3D printed ceramics. They are cups, so you can wash them or you can drink from them. And the bumps on them are representing sound. And so the question we were asking was, or the goal really was, how do we reveal, ignore, or hidden data in everyday domestic IoT artifacts through physicalization, right? So for those of you who might not know, physicalization is the idea of transforming data into a physical representation of that data, material. So it's very, it's kind of in contrast perhaps with visualizations, which use the 2D space to look at data. And so now we're engaging other senses because we're using a 3D object that also has kind of a weight and a texture and all that. Okay, so the data started in a spreadsheet. Okay, basically this was a very short project. It was a 1-week residency with Timi Atihani, who owns Slip Rabbit Studio, which is a ceramic studio in Seattle, where she does both slip casting, which is one mode of fabricating with ceramics, but also has a 3D printer, and was really interested in kind of starting to play with data in the printer. And so we captured 8 short clips of different kind of everyday environments. And so these 2 were my home at night. Some nights are quieter than others, apparently. And so there was a couple that were like on the street, a couple that were in a restaurant, some of them at the studio also. And so we had these captures, and we were then wondering, okay, well, what does it mean to translate that into a cup? And so here's the challenge, because how do you transform kind of a linear scale to texture? And so it's pretty, kind of the first thing you might think about is, let's do the version here on the left. So basically, a quiet noise would make a small bump, and then a louder noise would make a larger bump, right? That's pretty kind of obvious. And so that's what we did on the left one. So, these milliseconds is actually how long the printer pauses. And so the longer it pauses, the more clay is coming out, making a bigger bump at that moment on the 3D printer. And so that aligns with the decibel level. So, okay, fair. So we did that. We did these cups. We looked at them. We're like, okay. But then we, of course, asked, well, what else can we do? And so we wondered, what if instead we were trying to showcase kind of human voice in those recordings? And so human tone is usually around 60 to 65 decibels, and so we made the other score, where we said anything below 60 is going to be really kind of tiny, tiny little bumps, and then anything on these above 65 maybe is going to also be super small. So anything that is around voice level, that's going to be the big bumps. And so this is the same data, those two cups. They're clearly not the same. And so that's where I think this is one of the first projects I did with data physicalization and really working with data, and the realization of how much agency the designer or the artist has in choosing what, like, kind of creating the boundaries for what meaning is created of the data is really powerful. It's a really big amount of power that you have when you're choosing how do you kind of make those translations, those transformations. And so, of course, we kind of played with it, and we were like, okay, well, sometimes perhaps it becomes really easy to think about the stories that are coming out of these cups, right? Like, when is the morning happening? You know, when is the alarm coming on? Maybe this is clear when this is happening, right? Like, all of a sudden, everything is pretty loud. But sometimes it's more confusing. So this is one of the cups that's moving around. What event do you think produced that?
Yelling match?
Yeah, a big fight, maybe. What else could it be?
Big party?
Big party, yeah. Sorry, what?
An ambulance passing.
Oh, an ambulance passing by, yeah, it was pretty loud. What else? Ooh, yep, could it be? I think someone one time told me like there was a tiger, and I was like, what? Like, where do you think I live? But okay. Okay, actually, this was the printer's fault. There was a little bit of clay that got, or a little piece of hay that was caught in the clay, and so of course, as the printer's pushing it down, the clay was kind of obstructing the nozzle, and so nothing was coming out. So when you look at that cup, look at the pieces that are right before. The bumps are like not the same as the rest. So like the clay wasn't coming out, and then like we pulled it off, and like all the clay came out because the pressure had built up. And so this is my favorite example, because the stories we think we tell with data also come from how we produce the visualizations or the physicalizations in this case, right? We can't dissociate the instrument of producing the data physicalization from the actual story or the meaning that's coming through. And so of course that's an extreme example, but everything else that you're reading is also kind of now part of, part of how this printer works. Okay, so this project really foregrounded tactility as opposed to visual approach to understanding data. And so now I have these cups, I drink tea out of them, multiple times a week. And every time I drink tea, I can't help but keep on touching the little bumps and wondering like what actually happened in that moment that created that bump. And so this tactility allows for potentially this like longer engagement with meaning making in data. And then of course the data stories, how are they produced? How do we know how to trace back so that we make sense of the story, right? Like, is it the printer? Was it the yelling match or a tiger or whatever it was? And so these are kind of some of the two insights there. Also, the other cup that's going around that you saw, if you're comparing both of them, you'll see that we went through a lot of aesthetic calibration for this project. So the shorter one is kind of chunkier, looks like a knit kind of, and we felt like that didn't allow for as much reading of the data as the ones that you see here that are like a little bit more fine and that look a little bit more like a weave as a way. And so I'm happy to talk a lot more about kind of this like long, kind of slow process of fine tuning for how do you, and which is like a pretty subjective approach to like what's the right thing to do here. Okay, questions about the cups before I move on to the next project? You want to see the next one? Okay. All right, the next one is the data epics. So the data epics is a collection of 28 stories, which I'll maybe start some here and I'll start some over there. The data epics here, instead of going with something really material like the cups, we instead chose to think about fiction as a way to render data. And so, or to make this kind of creative data representation. And so basically what this project is it's really leaning into the idea that there is interpretation happening when you're translating data. And so if we agree on that, what happens if you push further? What happens if you really push into this kind of interpretative side of reading through data? And so we worked with 7 fiction writers in the Seattle area and 7 different households who lived in their homes with different devices, IoT devices. So we had like a Peloton bike, multiple voice assistants, door sensors, garage door opener, camera, thermostat, Sonos, range of everyday objects that kind of collect data. And so what we would do is we would ask the households to collect their data for a month, send it to us. We would anonymize it and clean it a little bit. So this is from a voice assistant. This is from a smart switch. And so basically we would clean it a little to make it a little bit more readable. So remove some of the metadata. So this is from a voice assistant. You can see some of the questions. How much are plane tickets to England? And then how do you rob a bank? Okay. Lots of people ask different things to voice assistants is what we learned from that. But they knew this was going to fiction writers, so I think they were playing a little. So who knows? Who knows if they were really asking or if they were playing with the author, which is part of the interpretation side of things. But so we cleaned it. When the data was numerical, we made simple visualizations as a way to help with the fiction writers, kind of just look at the data. So already, so this is thermostat over a whole month. So what happened here on March 6 and 7? Maybe they were out of town, I don't know. And then here, this is a bedside lamp that was in a smart plug. And so I think, you know, it looks like this person is usually kind of getting around to getting ready for bed around 9, turns off the light kind of around 10. But, you know, what happens here, you know, January 3rd, 3 a.m., something happened. So, okay. So already we can kind of make stories out of these, right? So of course, fiction writers, they have a much broader imagination than us, in a different one. We give them this, they go on and analyze the data in whichever way they want, write a story, send it to us, we typeset it, we make the books, then we send the books back to our participants who now read their data in the form of a book. And so it's really hard to understand this project if you don't read the story, so I encourage you to read as I'm talking, but also, which I rarely say, but okay. This is one excerpt. So this is Illumination. This is the story that is building on that bedside lamp visualization that I just showed. That's how it starts. She is born in darkness. The absence of light does not bother her, nor does it confuse her. Coming alive with the imperative of most living things, to move she does. At speeds almost incomprehensible, she rushes off as quickly as she can, determined not to be a laggard. Only knowing that she has a destination she must get to. She does not yet know what that destination is, only that she must get to it and quickly. So this story is written from the point of view of the data point. You got that. And so already, where are we? You know, like how is our encounter with data when we actually are following data on its own adventure to go from, you know, the light got turned on to I need to be in a server farm in Arizona, you know? And then like the story unfolds. I don't know who has that book right now, but the story unfolds and I might get you the punch. But this one data point that we're following in this story turns out that she was one of the data points that was like really off in the time and the timing. And so then we are following the parallel story of the woman who lives in that house, Paige in the story, who thinks that her husband is cheating on her because this point is off. It's not supposed to be there. And so like she keeps on like turning it on and off, like trying to like look at the data point. And this data point's like, wow, like I'm like cast into the sunlight all this time, and gets really excited. And then turns out it was just like a butt dial kind of thing situation where there was no infidelity happening. There was only this kind of like mistake that happened. And so that's the story, right? But the stories are all quite different. There's stories where the data is really there like wanting to serve. This idea of servitude is really powerful in a lot of the stories, which give me pause because this is something we understand very often about data, right? Like data, we create data for our own benefits as humans. And so when this comes back in the story, there's questions from my end of like, well, what else can it be? You know, what do data really want? Do they really want to help us, or can they have something else they might be interested in? Some of the stories from Josh Mary Wilkinson are very cheeky, and they're very much like, you thought you were going to have some meaning from the story? Think again. This is like a whole really surrealist, poetry kind of oriented story where it's really hard to make meaning. And so there's really something interesting to me about this kind of data pushing back and saying like, I'm not as malleable as you think. I can have my own resistance. And then that's really becoming kind of interesting. Okay, we made a website. It's called dataepics.studio. I encourage you all to look it up. That's where all 28 stories are. You can read them. The data that is associated with the stories are also there. And so you can understand, you know, what produced what story. You can, each author has about 4 stories, and you can kind of really get into, if you like a genre, you can follow it. When you go on the homepage, you can hover and see what kind of each story is about. So you can read what data it's coming from, but also, you know, some of the stories are really, really emotional and really about the connection, very close connection between people and data. She is my soul. You know, like, I don't know if you can get deeper than that in terms of connection. But then sometimes you get like, give me a basket of toes. And you're like, okay, this might be like more of a humoristic question. How do you rob a bank got into the story? That's a very fun one to read too. And then sometimes it's very much about the connection to the body. So Alex Madison, one of the authors, was really interested in like the conditions in which data are produced. I was born of her breath. We are both one body and many. The question of like where is the limit or the boundary between the person producing the data and then the data itself. So there's all these very existential questions that also came through from that project. Will I even outlast you? You know, that could be the human asking that, but that could also be the data. So there's a lot of kind of questions. Why do we exist? To be useful is to be free. Like, that's also a really weird kind of concept, but really thought-provoking. Okay, so with each family or each household, we worked on 4 stories, and every story took about 3 months to like collect the data, get the story, and give it back. And so we worked with these people for about a year. And we were really curious, like, okay, well, what's the impact of this? You know, like, I'm all here saying like, and this is how you change people's minds. And so, well, okay, what happened? So then 2 things really were interesting. So we met participants after every story to ask them, you know, like, how's it going? What did you think of the story? Could you see your data? Could you see yourself? Does it make you think about your data differently? And every time they would say like, I didn't have any expectations for the story, except I was really expecting to see myself in it. And you're like, this is an expectation. But okay. So there was this real desire to see yourself in the story. Of course, like, you're giving your story to somebody who is going to write a story for you. And there was kind of a disconnect between how that happened. And there's this idea of like the data twin, right? Like, which is kind of common in HCI and also STS, this idea that data is kind of an extension of you, a portrait of you. And I think for this, it's more of a distorted twin, or like broken mirror twin that we could see, where you could get parts of it. Sometimes you would see like, oh my God, I did say that, you know? But I see your question. But there was kind of always this idea of like, oh, well, I'm open to multiple things, but still I want to see glimpses of me. Yes?
Sorry, maybe I missed this part, but is it good in the fact that they have different data sets, or are like two stories from the same data set?
Yeah, each book is a different data set. So each household has 4 stories. Sometimes if somebody, for example, lived with like only a voice assistant, then each story would come from the same voice assistant, but at different times of the year. So you'd get like a January one, then like a March, or whatever. And each household worked with the same author for the whole time. So they could sometimes recognize the style, not always. Some households had multiple devices, and so we would switch between stories. And so the first story could be a voice assistant, well, it could be like a thermostat. The second one could be the smart bed. The third one, the voice assistant. And then the last one, maybe the smart home camera. In those cases, we usually tried to go from like more abstract data to more concrete. So going from like a thermostat, which basically just gives you temperature, to like an actual camera when you can see, what's going on the street in front. There's different level of how much you know really from the household. So yeah. And then we also ask people, has your relationship to data, like how's it changed over the last year? And they usually say nothing's changed, except I unplugged the Alexa and I don't want to use it anymore. And then they're like, oh, okay, and that's not related to the project. And they were like, not really. I was like, okay. So there is like I think what this kind of points to, actually, is this really subtle change that happens through this project, where people are not able to pinpoint directly what's happening. And there is I think because it was over such a long period of time, and there was both the fact that we were asking them to access their data was a big part of the project so that they could send it to us. And that's not a trivial part of the project. That's actually hard to do for many of these devices. And so for people to have to do that and then to read the stories and us keeping on asking, I think there was a lot of different kind of probing that was happening through the project that had them consider perhaps a little differently how they are engaging with data. And so, that wasn't the case for all the households. Some of the households were like, yeah, I have nothing to hide, and I still have nothing to hide. And so, I might maintain how I live with my data. But some other households had some of these shifts happen, which was kind of interesting and promising in a way for this project. Part of this project is really about building these new imaginaries. So remember this kind of image of the Google search, all the data is just blue on this black background. Well, in these stories, we have like so many metaphors around aquatic things, many metaphors about the body, many images around relationships, which is really interesting. And so we're actually right now working on a dictionary of data imaginaries that are kind of trying to pull some of the images here and also from our conversations with the participants to start to build another palette, like it's a different view of what data can be or feel like. And then this getting closer point is really about, it's like a pitch for imagination, basically, and for fiction, right? So if data is so hard to access and we had to like actively support our participants in getting their data from their devices, imagination might be another way to really get closer to data, to really start to think about data, and to have it as part of our everyday lives that can open up some new doors. And so this idea of getting closer through imagination is what's kind of coming out of that project. Okay, questions on the data epics? Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So one, in terms of the writers writing the story, was there a limit in terms of based on who was reading it? For example, if kids would be reading it versus if adults, like how they have to structure the story and like, obviously the diction that they could use, what type of readings they're allowed. That's my first question.
Yeah.
But I'll let you answer.
Yeah. So we worked with households where there The stories were not for the kids. So 2 households had kids, but the stories were not for them. Basically because that wasn't I think it would be a very different project if that was the angle we wanted to take. And so we targeted adults instead. And so there wasn't really anything that was like completely off the table in terms of what they could write. So there's a range of things that happen in the stories. We gave them kind of a ballpark word. We said it's a short story and a kind of a ballpark word count, but it really varied. Like some of them are much longer than others. And we gave the authors a few prompts. So we gave them the data. We told them what device it was coming from. We gave them no information about the households at all, like who lives there, how many people, what kind of house it is. We quiet on that. But we gave them, because we wanted to really support kind of these other perspectives on data, we gave them a few excerpts of reading that cast data slightly differently. So one of the stories, we gave them kind of images of data centers just to say like, hey, like data is not completely immaterial, like it actually exists in some places. We gave them, one of them was really about the kind of the relation to the human body. And so some of those themes are kind of coming back through. Yeah, I expanded on your question.
My second question is, in terms of the family saying they didn't feel like they had that kind of personal connection, where it's like they want to see themselves in the story, would it have, I guess, like changed things, or would it have been different if the authors approached it more from the angle of using inanimate objects to kind of portray the data, but in the form of like fiction?
Wait, so still in fiction, but they would build an object, or the object would be the character?
I guess like they'd be personifying like either like anything that wasn't human, basically, or living in a sense.
Yeah. I think I see what you're getting at. So some stories did that. Some stories were really focused on like the device. Some stories were really focused just on the data and had no connection to humans at all. And then some stories had humans part of them. I don't think that's what made a difference, really. It was more about, sometimes it was like the world that was created, and it was kind of like, do I even know that my data is part of that? Sometimes it was about trying to, sometimes it was like, especially for the voice assistants, people were trying to find the phrases they had said, you know? And so that was a way for them to kind of, but even when they did, so like, how do you rob a bank? Like, of course, the author doesn't have the context for why that was said. And so they have to reinvent a whole other story to put this in the story. And so there's kind of I think especially the expectations were much higher the first story, because they were like, I think a lot of people were expecting the authors to do kind of detective work, to kind of be like, okay, how many people do I think exist in this house? And like, what is the house I think? And like trying to rewrite their life from the last month. And that's impossible to do with only one data set. And so none of the authors did that. However, some of the authors actually caught the vibes really well, but that felt eerie. And so then it's like, is that better or not? Because now it's kind of this weird kind of uncanny valley of how much do they really know just through the data? Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
What were like the emotions associated with not feeling represented by the stories? Like, was it kind of a disappointment, or, I mean, some of the stories were like, you know, cheating or something. Yeah. Like, did people get upset about that, or was it just kind of like, oh, like that's weird?
Yeah, okay, so the cheating one, the person whose data that was is a woman who's 68 or 9 and lives on her own and doesn't have a husband, and so she just thought it was funny. There's another one, the Peloton data was really funny, because there was like 2 stories from the Peloton, and in both stories the human character is like an old man, but it's actually a younger, like 30-ish age woman who, like, that's her data, and she was like, are you saying I have like the heartbeat of an old man now? Like, so there was, I don't think it was frustration. I think it was kind of just, it was surprise, and it was a little bit of a pause. I think the reflection that happened was more around, oh, this isn't just about me. And like, oh, data has these other things that happen to it that I never considered before, which was part of our goal. So in a way that was good from like a research perspective. And I think, as the stories continued on, people actually had less and less expectations because they were like, I don't know what's going to happen with this. I think, yeah, and sometimes representation wasn't only about like, you chose the wrong character. It was more of like, oh, this isn't even a story that is happening in a house. Like this is like, this data is now in the like transatlantic cable under the sea trying to ping to some other place. And so that's where there was some of that kind of surprise that happened, and sometimes frustration. Yeah, and then some stories were like really, really metaphorical. And so it's almost impossible to know that the data, like what even is the data for the story. So like an example for that is the story Intelligence, which is based on Sonos data, which I thought was going to be the series of songs that people have played. Turns out that's not that at all. It's basically just kind of where was music played, like when was the service kind of accessed, and so it doesn't say very much. But that's the story where basically Intelligence says it's kind of this like long monologue from the intelligence, which is the data, kind of just basically saying like, you thought there was going to be meaning and there's no meaning, and so that's it. Yeah.
So kind of piggyback on that question, from like a research perspective, one, coming up with this idea is blows my mind how you guys thought of this. It's really cool. But then like, was there an expectation from your guys' perspective of like, were you expecting the data to match kind of these households versus like the people themselves? You always see yourself in like your own data. Like, what were you guys' hypothesis and did it align?
Yeah, we were not hoping that they would see themselves actually, because the goal was really about like the title Data Epics. Epics is really the story of a long journey going and discovering things. And so it's really this idea that data has their own adventures that we never think of. And so we were hoping for these stories to be far away, like the Odyssey type. So that was our intention. Of course, then like when your participants are like, we have to do this 3 more times. And then like you're questioning a little bit like, okay, well, is this the right thing? And then like keep going. So that's for that part of the question. And then the other side of your question, before doing this, we had an interview study where kind of like contextual inquiry study where we pre-COVID visited people's homes and asked them, show us your IoT devices, tell us what data they produce, show us the data if you know how to, and tell us how you engage with it. And basically what came back was, I know the data's there, I only look at it when there's a bug or like an accident or an incident, and it's like a good to have kind of thing. And if you read that paper at the end, we kind of come up with some directions, or actually for each theme, we kind of created a speculative sketch that tries to push on the theme that we saw. And so Data Epics was one of those. And so to create these 5 sketches, we probably sketched 150 before, and then like narrow, like the design process was from a lot to just a few. And so, yeah, the Data Epics was like a post-it called Data Epics. And then we were like, we should try it. And then here we are. Yeah. Okay, one more question, and then I have more things I want to show. Yeah.
In terms of the participants, you said that even though the intention was for them to like feel distant from the data, or kind of have data have drawn its own epic, would it have changed things, or in your opinion, if they were the ones giving the prompts, whether it was keywords like, oh, I'd like to see my data represented this way, would it have built like more of a connection with the users?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because then, then they're giving like creative direction to the writer. I think it would have changed completely the experience for the writers, because now because I think in this scenario, they felt like perhaps like we were the client more than the reader. And But if it's like the reader is giving you like, I want this in the style of a murder mystery, then then it's a really different kind of experience, and it's a really different ask on the fiction writer. What we wanted was really to tap into the imaginative capacity of the writers, and that's why we wanted them to kind of go in the direction they wanted. And the prompts were not about the type of story; they were more of like, here's a little information about data. And we did that because we did a pilot study before doing. So we did like a set of 4 stories, and then we did the 24 others. And in that first set, we didn't give any prompts. But the author told us that, like she had to go and watch the Magic Bus episode on data with her kids to like figure out how data works to be able to write the story. And we're like, wow, okay. Like, I get the hint that like maybe we could support better. And so, yeah. Yes.
Did the writers have any awareness of like who they were writing for, or was that, oh, sweet, okay.
Full secret. And then at the end, when all the stories were done and when the website was finished, we did a public launch of the website where we invited all the writers. They did a live reading of one of their stories, and we invited the participants back. So that was the first time they met. And not all the participants were able to make it, and 6 out of the 7 authors were there. But the ones that met, it was a weird moment. And like I was really excited because like we knew, as a research team, we knew both sides, and we're like, oh my god, when they meet, it's gonna be.
You're sitting in the corner going.
Yes, definitely. Tried to not be too creepy. Yeah. Okay, I have 10 minutes. I'll show you stuff quickly. Stop me when you want. Okay, the odd interpreters is a set of devices that also cast data differently. There's 3 of them. The middle one is the data bakery, which transforms data into cookie recipes for you to bake and then eat your data. Most of the recipes are terrible. Broadcast is picking up on traffic that your Alexa is. So when Alexa is sending and receiving data, that's data traffic. And so broadcast just lets you know, like, hey, data's moving around. The main thing that happened with that project is that in a very naive way, I and our research team thought that data is only moving around when you're talking to Alexa. Not true. Of course, there's always these like, is there an update? It's making sure it's on the network. So this was a sound project. So these are some of the sounds that we represented. So when data was moving around, kind of similar to the data epic side of like, what are the adventures? These were some of the sounds we proposed as like, think about your data being somewhere else. So some of it was trying to be about, how does data sound like when it's moving, and then where does it go? The data is always kind of, so we thought there's only going to be a few peaks, and that's how we made our kind of interaction model, which is anytime data is moving, there's a little kind of blink, and sometimes it can make some noise for you to catch the sounds by turning that ball. But now I can do that in the night and wake you up. So that wasn't our intention, but that happens now. So yes, big summary, IoT data have connections way beyond the home. And then it has an impact back when it's in your home. Okay, soft fading is one project where we really were trying to turn the idea of data up on its head. And so instead of thinking about data as digital, really thinking about it as completely analog and only material. And so basically what it is that it's the cylinder with fabric that was dyed with turmeric but not fixed, which means that it can fade over time. So, the fabric in the beginning, and then after like 5 weeks, if you just leave it like that in the sun. But now it's on that cylinder and it turns, and so it means that it turns 1 turn a day. So every day, the same piece of fabric is exposed to the same kind of light. So we thought this is what the fabric would look like when you take it out, right? But then we put it in a home and we saw this. And we were like, oh yeah, shadows and things and people move and you might move it. And so there's all these other things that happen. And so this really is about this reminder that the way data is collected influences the data, obviously. When the first try we got this and we were like, what is going on? What happened? Turns out we needed a mechanical engineer on our team to figure out how this thing should be turning and not slipping. So we fixed it. And then we got this. So winter in Seattle, summer in Seattle. We have more sun in the summer, it's nicer. But that's, that was the hypothesis pretty much. But what I think is the most interesting about this project is this idea that there is no record of every single day. There is only a collection because it just keeps on adding to itself, right? It's like, it's an archive that keeps making itself and you can never go to the one data point. And that to me is like such a different way of thinking about data. And I want to keep exploring that. The other thing that's interesting with this project is, okay, after 2 months, maybe you take it out. If you really like it and want to pin it on your wall, it's going to keep on fading. And it'll eventually disappear. And so it really opens up all these questions about, do we need to keep the data? Why do we need to keep all of our data? Can we have this idea of data disappearing and forgetting? All these questions about the right to forget are also kind of entangled in this project as well. Okay, I have 3-4 minutes, so I will go. And this is Voices and Voids, voicesandvoids.net. I invite you to go visit it. This is a whole website just about voice assistant data, 26 archives, lots of weird things on this one, which I will invite you to go see. That's all part of it. But I want to get to here. Okay, so this is the conclusion. There's I think maybe 6 different tips I want to share with you. So personal IoT data are difficult to access. That is one thing we need to work on. If we want people to be able to reclaim their data and do some of that stuff for themselves and actually access and understand their own data, they need to have access. It's hard. Some of these projects during the data epics, some devices and services changed how you access data multiple times. So we had to rewrite the instructions for participants multiple times. And we're pretty good at this. For people who are not familiar with that, that's really hard. Data engagements and encounters don't have to be based in productivity or functionality. I hope I showed that today. Imagining might be our best way to get closer to data. And so this is a big pitch for imagination as a way of knowing also. Data materialization or physicalization is a subjective act. I showed you that very clearly, I think, with the listening cups, but that's also true for any other ways we work with data. When we do a visualization, we might be more used to it, but it's still a subjective act, the way we decide how to represent data. And that comes with control and power, and we have to be careful about how we use that. Matters of labor, intimacy, everyday life, surveillance capitalism, temporality, and creative potential are all entangled in IoT data. And I just really like seeing these words side by side as things that exist together there. It does come down to an ontological question, which is, what is it like to be with data? What is our life with data? And what should it be? And for whom? And who decides? A lot of questions. Okay, and then this is, I think, the last two. In making data materialization, we are not only shaping people's understanding of that data, right, that thing that happened, that event, but we're also shaping their view of what data is and what counts as data. And I think that's really powerful to think about that, right? Like there's kind of the hands-on, this is your story based on your Peloton story, but now also maybe you think about data in general as a different thing. Okay, so many students have been part of these projects, so many of them undergrads and so many of them grads, and I have to say thank you. So here they are. Also thank you to the many very generous funders for these projects. And thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take more questions. Also feel free to reach out. Yeah, that's it.